October 7, 2023 has irreversibly changed the Middle East. The region will never be the same again. The spillover from that day is still being seen and felt well into 2024, directly and not so directly in many Arab countries. But what does this change entail, and what are the repercussions we're still witnessing to this day? There's no doubt about it. 2024 seems to have been a year of reckoning. Israel's war in Gaza has caused a ripple effect across the region, leaving behind a trail of destruction, mass killing, starvation, and the gravest breaches of international law. We're already seeing the fundamentally consequential impacts of this. The question of Palestine, unresolved for decades, has become an international priority as more countries take the lead to recognize it officially as a state. At the same time, what a Palestinian state would look like is facing an existential threat as the pressure mounts to end the war in Gaza, reform the Palestinian Authority, and usher in a new era of peace in the region, especially with the return of President Donald Trump. In the meantime, cases in the world's highest courts have put Israel's occupation and military approach in Gaza into serious question for the very first time. In Lebanon and Syria, power dynamics are shifting after the weakening of Hezbollah, the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, and the fall of Bashar Al Assad's government. In the background of all of this, Israel is seizing territories across its border in unprecedented land grabs from neighboring countries, as it says it's determined to stay in the so-called buffer zone between it and Syria, for example. Iran's role in the region has also come to a critical crossroad, as it on one hand bolsters its relationship with neighboring Arab countries while seemingly distancing itself from its proxies in Syria, Lebanon, and its allies in Yemen. For the millions of people in the Middle East, a sense of fear, uncertainty, and anxiety has lingered. These feelings overshadowed only by the extreme fatigue of bearing witness to the unfathomable human suffering in Gaza and beyond. But there's also hope, dim as it may be, as talks inch closer to a ceasefire. So if 2024 was defined by conflict, could 2025 be the year of resolution? This is Beyond the Headlines, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. In our last episode of the year, we take a step back in time and reflect on the most significant events that took place across the region. We'll look at how they will play out in 2025, reshaping politics, maps, and even life in the Middle East.
Ceasefire now. Hundreds of millions of people are saying that in all corners of the globe.
They're the most intense aerial campaign into Syria in years, but also particularly after the fall of the government of Bashar Al Assad.
There has been no shortage of life-changing moments this past year. Wars, assassinations, and regime changes. Here at The National, our team of reporters and correspondents have been covering these fast-developing stories minute by minute. I'm joined today by our foreign editor, Mohammed Ali Harisi, to discuss this more in depth. Ali, let's start more broadly first. Israel's war in Gaza is still raging on after more than a year and several attempts at a ceasefire. Not only has it not ended there, but over the course of the year, it overflowed into Lebanon and now in Syria. How did we get here? What were the key mistakes, if you want to call them that, throughout the year that allowed this conflict to get so out of hand?
I think this was one of the most exhausting years for anyone living in the Middle East. I personally felt like I was in a boxing ring and being punched all the time, not knowing where the punches are coming from. Seriously. You know, at the beginning of the Gaza war, when the Israelis said that this war would last for 3 months, 4 months, we were surprised and shocked. And we immediately calculated how many people would die. But now it's been over a year. And it's so unbelievable that we are still unable to see the end of this conflict. I think there are several reasons why this war has continued until now, and it's still continuing. One, Israel's main goal for the war was to eradicate Hamas. Hamas hasn't been eradicated yet. Hamas is still able to fire back, to fight Israeli forces in a few places in Gaza. And I think until Israel realizes that Hamas won't be a threat anymore, it won't stop. 2, Israel got greedy. They occupied the Philadelphia corridor. They created some kind of border crossing, but in the middle of the Gaza Strip. And now they think that they are able to build or to occupy parts of the northern Gaza Strip and create some kind of buffer zone. 3, Hamas didn't show the needed flexibility to come to terms with the fact that this is the maximum you can do and it's time to sit on the table and reach a deal to stop the killing of Gazans. One more reason is Iran trying to take advantage of the situation and empowering its proxies to prove, until recently, that it has arms in the Middle East that can be a match to Israel and the US firepower. One more reason, and I think this is the main reason why the war continued until now, is the lack of US pressure and the absence of a strong and coherent US foreign policy that can pressure Israel or force Israel to end the conflict. I think the US has given Israel the green light to continue doing what it's doing, and I think the war will never stop until the US tells Israel to stop the war.
In January, Ali, the world watched a historic case at the International Court of Justice brought forth by South Africa, accusing Israel of genocide. There was a moment there where the world expected this would pressure Israel to stop its military campaign in Gaza. A year later, the ICC has issued warrants for Israeli leaders, as we know. But can we actually see these instruments of international justice have any impact, do you feel? Or is this going to just make Israel look worse on the international scale?
I don't think Israel cares anymore about its image. It's as simple as that. If you go and create a killing machine, and this machine keeps killing people left and right, and no one tries to stop it, why would you stop it? If I cared about the image, I would have stopped since the first 2-3 months, right? I mean, there is no pressure. There are no sanctions. We've heard many, for example, European officials saying we need to sanction Israeli extremist politicians. Okay, sanctions them. But we haven't seen it. It's not going to happen unless the US says to Israel or pressures Israel to stop the war is not going to stop. And a few months after the start of the war, with the failure of the US stopping the aggression and the invasion of Gaza and the constant bombing, it became a US-Israeli war, which means that in order to stop the war, 2 sides have to make the decision, Israel and the US. And the US hasn't decided yet. I think now there is a race against time because they're trying to end it before President-elect Donald Trump takes office. And I think that the decision has been made that Israel should try and continue the war in a way that it helps it accomplish most of its goals until January 20.
So you think that the Trump administration will usher in a new era, basically, for Gaza and Israel and even the Palestinian state?
I don't know what Trump administration's vision for Palestine would be. It could be a disaster. It could be even worse than now. But I think that there has been a decision that the war cannot continue as Trump takes office. Like we've seen in different places and other places in the region. Lebanon, for example, and even Syria, by the way. It's very hard to believe that everything that has happened in Syria over 10 days had nothing to do with the Trump effect.
What happened in Syria did not happen in vacuum, right? It happened at a very critical and crucial time.
100%. You have to think about it more broadly or more globally. Trump is coming. The war in Ukraine is dragging, right? The Russians are in Syria. Bashar Al Assad was already falling, and the army had absolutely no power on the ground. So one of the possibilities is that there was some kind of a deal that we are still trying to uncover.
Right now, with Iran trying to strengthen its relationship with the Gulf states and the Arab states, do you think that Iran is trying to distance itself from its proxies? And perhaps, is this the end of the so-called axis of resistance?
I think the so-called axis of resistance has been beaten, broken, even defeated, but it hasn't been completely eradicated. With the exception of the Houthis in Yemen, who have different agendas than Hezbollah and Hamas and the Iraqi militias, Israel or the war has eliminated the regional threat of Iran's proxies in the Middle East and turned them into more a localized threat. So Hezbollah is still powerful in Lebanon. Hamas is still powerful in the Palestinian scene. Iraqi militias, despite not launching any attacks and despite the unannounced truce with the Americans, they're still powerful in Iraq. But regionally, the war has managed, or Israel, I don't know if we call it Israel, but the war in general has clipped their wings, regional wings, and localized their power and their threat. As for Iran distancing itself, I don't think it is distancing itself from its proxies. Well, it never said that it had proxies anyway. It says that those are resistance groups that we support with whatever we can. Of course, this is not true, and this is part of a big Iranian project in the region. But I think that Iran has to realize that its regional project has been defeated, and it's time to sit and think about a different strategy. You mentioned the Gulf. The Gulf has been instrumental in telling the Iranians that we need to have good relations with you, but you need to be honest about your intentions. If you're gonna meddle in our affairs all the time, if you're gonna support non-state actors, if you wanna build a nuclear program without being transparent about it, then it won't be accepted.
Let's go back to Lebanon and then we'll go to the Houthis. Hassan Nasrallah was killed. This is an end of an era. What is the reality of the killing of Hassan Nasrallah on Hezbollah, on Lebanon, and even on the region potentially?
I remember before the killing of Hassan Nasrallah, we always imagined what would the reaction be. Like we always said that this would be an earthquake. This would be the beginning of something we've never seen before. But nothing happened. Almost nothing happened. Yeah. And to be honest, it proved that most of the things that even Nasrallah said were just words. Like, for example, we have heard that if there will be a full-scale war with Israel, it will be building for building, civilian for civilian, soldier for soldier. It didn't happen. Like most of the things that were planted in people's heads, that this is a militia or a militant group that can be more powerful than a state and that can defend the whole country against the enemy, is not true. You can't. You're a non-state actor. There is absolutely no way for a militant group to protect a whole country and act like the army. So now Hezbollah has been weakened. Its leaders have been killed. Its firepower has been eliminated by more than half, maybe 70%. It doesn't have a role in Syria anymore. No. I mean, it's time to sit and reflect on everything that has happened and stop claiming that you were victorious because you weren't killed completely.
Tensions have also escalated between Israel and Yemen's Houthi rebels, another militant group backed by Iran.
The Houthis have continued to launch these reckless attacks with no regard for the well-being of innocent civilians who are transiting through the Red Sea.
A surge of attacks from Yemen's Iranian-backed Houthi rebels on ships traveling through the Red Sea continues to disrupt the global supply chain.
Can we talk about what you imagine will happen to the Houthis? Because the Houthis seem to have been acting, yes, with Iranian support, they are Iranian linked, but they seem to be acting out of their own accord to some degree. What do you imagine will happen for the Houthis? Or are they just going to go back to being less of a regional threat and still remain in existence?
I think this is a very good question. They don't completely rely on Iran to make decisions. They have their own agendas. This analysis that with the defeat of Hezbollah in Lebanon, Houthis are Iran's new Hezbollah doesn't make a lot of sense, because the Houthis, it's true that they are a militia, but they have a completely different project for themselves in the region. Their main goal is to be recognized as a legitimate political and military power. The Houthis are the only militant group that controls a capital without any fighting or resistance. So if you go and sit at the table now to negotiate a peace deal for Yemen, you're not negotiating the same people as 2023. They look the same.
But they're not.
But they're not. They're more armed with a bigger regional reputation, right? They showed you that they can disrupt a global economy.
And shipping.
And they showed you for the first time in history that they can attack Israel from 1,800 kilometers away. It's unbelievable. And these are all points that they are scoring. So when the final settlement comes, they would say, this is what we have accomplished. Give us what we deserve. And what they think they deserve is all of Yemen.
What can you tell us about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham's rebranding, al-Jolani's rebranding? We stopped calling him Jolani anymore even. The US dropped the bounty on him, the $10 million bounty on him. What can you tell us about what's going on in Syria right now in terms of governance, the US role? What's going on?
What happened in Syria was shocking. It felt like a movie, It wasn't real. And the way it happened gives a small indication that something political was happening behind the scenes. And this transition, especially for Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and for its leader, from an extremist organization to Islamist, to military, to a political almost party, I think we need to wait and see how this would develop. But it's so hard to believe that yesterday it was wartime, today it's Thai time, and suddenly this change can happen overnight. And those people who believed in something completely different than what they're claiming to be establishing now can just change their views overnight and become different people, unless this was planned from the beginning.
I welcome the fact that Assad has gone. The Syrian people had to put up with his brutal regime for far, far too long.
The fall of the Assad regime gives hope to the Syrian people, the hope of returning to their homes and rebuilding their lives.
The United States will work with our partners and the stakeholders in Syria to help them seize an opportunity to manage the risks.
Recently, the US sent diplomats to Damascus. The EU sent diplomats to Damascus. We have seen Arab countries sending diplomats to Damascus. Each party going to Syria now has a different goal. The US wants to protect its bases and soldiers, 2,000 now in Syria. It wants to protect the armed groups that it is supporting. Turkey wants to make sure that its borders with Syria is threat-free. Jordan wants to make sure that its border with Syria is drug-free.
Yeah.
The EU wants to make sure there is a plan for the return of the refugees and to stop illegal immigration.
Let's talk about 2025. What happens to Gaza? What happens to everything that has changed in the Middle East in the past year?
As long as there is bombing in Gaza, the region will stay fragile. The war in Lebanon almost stopped. The war in Syria, the civil war in Syria, almost stopped. There is no fighting, and the situation is kind of
Stable. Mm.
Unless the war in Gaza stops, 2025 is going to be even worse than 2024. Now, let's say that the war stops in Gaza. You breathe and you hope for the best, right?
Mm.
You sleep, you wake up, and you find yourself facing huge problems, huge challenges, reconstruction, rebuilding institutions, governance. What happens to the Palestinian Authority? What happens to Hamas? Who governs Gaza? Hezbollah in Lebanon? Will it become an even more integrated into the political life of Lebanon instead of playing the role of the army? In Syria, will Hayat Tahrir al-Sham achieve what it is claiming that it can achieve? There are many question marks about the future of this region, about what's going to happen next, about lives of people who are traumatized and will be traumatized for the rest of their lives, about people who lost loved ones and they have to live with this pain until the last day of their lives. But the main thing that is certain is that 2024 was indeed one of the most exhausting years in the history of the Middle East. And in 2025, the Middle East, after the war stops, is never going to be the same again.
What we just heard was as much of a comprehensive prediction and wrap-up of what has happened this past year as we can fit into one episode for you. But there's so much more on our website at thenationalnews.com. That's it for Beyond the Headlines this week and this year, and we thank you so much for listening to all of what our experts and officials have had to share on our show. Needless to say, it's been a year full of trials and tribulations for our region, and we'll continue to bring you more in-depth analysis and coverage in the new year. This episode of Beyond the Headlines was produced by Ban Barqawi and sound engineered by Arthur Edison. Dua Farid is your editor, and I'm your host, Nada Al-Tahir. Thank you for listening.